Hello, world, and welcome to the first episode of the Geeks from the Trap podcast. Geeks from the Trap is my series where we talk about hip hop, comics, tech, fashion, movies, games, TVs, models, and cosplayers. We had the Instagram up and running for a while. My blog is technically the hosting spot for it, callmail.com. But when you get to the entertainment point, you will see this menu that says Geeks from the Trap, where we just basically just talk about geek and street culture. That's basically what we talk about on this site. And today's episode, I wanted to talk about Lovecraft Country. Lovecraft Country is an American drama horror television series developed by Misha Green based on the 2016 novel of the same name by Matt Ruff. And it's crazy because when I first heard about this, I was like, who's Matt Ruff? Where is this guy from? And then I found out he's from Queens, New York, and they're like, oh, please be black, please be black, please be black. He wasn't black. He wasn't black at all. But, I'm digging the story, so I'm going to look past that right now. But the series is produced by Monkey Paw Productions, which is from Jordan Peele, the guy who brought us Get Out and Us, and, the reboot of The Twilight Zone, and shows like Hunters. It's also produced by Bad Robot. Bad Robot is from J.J. Abrams, who's done shows like Lost and Alias, and done films like Mission Impossible 3, and I think he produced 4, 5, 6, and up to one that's coming up. And, of course, Warner Brothers Television. But, the story is about a young black man who traveled across segregated 1950s United States in search of his missing fathers, learning of dark secrets plaguing the town on which famous horror H.P. Lovecraft supposedly based the location of his many fictional tales. So through this series in the book, we follow Atticus Freeman as he joined up with his friend Lydia and his Uncle George, and they embarked the road trip again across 1950s Jim Crow America. And, the whole show is about them struggling to survive and overcome both racist terrors of white America and the terrifying monsters that are pretty much ripped from the Lovecraft paperback novels. Now, if you've never read H.P. Lovecraft, Howard Philip Lovecraft work, he was a writer of weird fiction, horror fiction. I've learned of him from South Park, where they talk about the Cthulhu monster mythos. Cthulhu, is I think in multiple works of H.P. Lovecraft. It's probably like a shared universe, but the monster is like this giant squid wing, I don't even know how to even describe this monster, but the monster showed up in one of his earlier pulp fiction magazine, Weird Tales, in I believe it was 1928, and the story of called Cthulhu. A lot of people said they didn't know about the Tulsa Massacre until after they saw it on Watchmen, and I'm one of the guys who probably learned it from the Hidden Colors documentary series, and of course you hear like a few rappers who brought up Black Wall Street growing up, so it wasn't new to us, but it was just shocking to see it on something like on HBO, and it's such a huge property as like Watchmen. So I wanted to see if HBO would do it again with Lovecraft Country, and they definitely did not disappoint. I can tell you that. Now, this show that was developed back in May 2017. HBO announced that it gave a series order, and that Misha Green, Jordan Peele, J.J. Abrams, and Ben Stephenson will be producing the show, with Green serving as the series showrunner. Now, if you guys don't know Misha Green, I hope I'm saying her name right, but Misha Green, she wrote and produced stuff like Underground. That was a historical drama about slavery. She also was a staff writer for Heroes and Sons of Anarchy, and I believe was a producer on the show Helix. And when I first heard about this show, I was like, what is this? What kind of show is this gonna be? Because you get cautious, especially when you hear a story that is written by a white author about black folks. You get cautious. Well, for me, I'm definitely cautious. So names like Jordan Peele and Mr. Green probably was one thing that made me feel like, maybe I could give this production a try. And as well as the cast also got my attention. You got Journey Smollett, who I grew up watching on Full House, and then she was also in the series Underground, seen in films like Tyler Perry's Temptations. She played Letty Lewis. She also was in the Birds of Prey movie that came out earlier this year. You have Jonathan Majors, who plays Atticus Freeman, and he's been, pretty much getting around a lot lately from movies like White Boy Rick and, Out the Blue, Last Black Man in San Francisco, Captive State, The Five Bloods, which I really enjoyed him in. You also have Courtney B. Vance, who is playing George Freeman, the well-read uncle. Michael K. Williams looked like he's going to be in this series as well. I've seen it in the trailer. Jamie Chung. So it's like, there was a lot of people in this production. I was like, this got my attention. This has my attention. And I saw the first episode yesterday, and, I knew it was going to deal with, the book, the 2016 dark fantasy horror novel by Matt Ruff, definitely explores the racism in the United States during the era of Jim Crow laws. And the series don't hide from it. And, part of me, when I was watching it, like, am I going to be able to sit through this? Because I wasn't sure if the dark fantasy element was going to be just in the main character's head, and he was just, relating, the horror of H.P. Lovecraft novels to how racism was around that time, because that's how I felt in the beginning, and I was like, oh, maybe he's just going to be a thing in his head. But as the show kept going, it was like, oh, no, there's some legit horror fantasy stuff going on in the show. It's not just the racist, that's the horror of, horror, the racism isn't just horror. The horror isn't just racism, even though it plays a huge part. It's funny how, if you want to do a cheap horror movie, you really don't need monsters. All you need is just a couple racists. Like, I'm over here thinking, like, maybe I should just do a horror movie about the Klan. Like it's really very simple to do a horror story, and with the horror is coming from racism. When the horror stems from racism, it's a lot easier to tell those stories, and it's still very scary. It's dreadful to watch, But the first episode is called Sundown, and when I heard that, I was like, oh boy, let's see where this goes, because Sundown is a reference to sundown towns, and they brush past it a little bit in the show. But for those who don't understand what a sundown town is where towns were in America where black folks were not allowed to be there after the sun went down. If they caught you there after the sun went down, it basically became the purge, And, I've always thought about, like, what would that look like on screen? And, I've wrote my own version of like, stories about what a sundown town would look like on screen, like my own little horror thriller. But they did it perfectly well in this first episode, And there was a lot of things, in this episode where there was, like, a lot of references, and if you was, like, not within the culture, it probably would have went over your head, certain shots that were in it was just like, whoa, I've seen this somewhere before. Like, there were shots of, like, a whole bunch of people looking for work, which I've definitely seen so many times in history books, there was this one photo of, like, this mother and child, and she's, like, she's fixing her daughter's dress, and they just, like, recreated the exact shots from these photos. I'm like, you gotta give Mr. Green her credit, her due, because she killed that first episode. As a director, as a creator, she did her thing, In the opening of the show, there's the opening monologue where in the beginning of the first sequence of Sundown, where is a quote from the 1950 biopic of the Jackie Robinson story, And, I thought it was so interesting because, the monologue was talking about, this is the story of a boy and his dream. And, the narrator recounts our hero, a.k.a. Tick, Atticus, and he literally fighting a war in the first scene. And, 1 minute we're watching, World War II, then it goes into them fighting giant UFOs and flying Chitolis. And it's like, oh, shit, this is something, And, in the middle of this war, here comes Jackie Robinson knocking out the monster. And I'm just like, wow. Now, this is something to watch. This is something to check out, because I didn't see any of this coming. Not at all. Now, the book that we see Tick reading on a bus in Sundown is A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. The book that pretty much gave him that dream sequence, The guy who wrote Tarzan, matter of fact, wrote The Princess of Mars, which is the installment of the first series. It's a series of sci-fi adventure novels, series such as John Carter. I don't know if y'all ever read John Carter. I never saw John Carter. The movie, the Disney movie that failed miserably, but I've heard of the novels. They're also known as the Barsoom series. So, I believe because there was like an alien land around there or whatever. I don't know the story precise. I'm not gonna act like it, but there was a alien that was from that novel that was referenced in the series. You know, in Tick's dream, he gets to greet a beautiful alien who descends from a UFO, and that's basically a reference from the book, A Princess from Mars. You know, we also see Weird Tales in it. Weird Tales was the magazine that had the Pulp Fiction written by H.P. Lovecraft. You know, it was a popular magazine that ran from 1923 to 1954 and fueled much of geek culture for the first half of 20th century. You know, it published numerous works of H.P. Lovecraft, you know, also like Ray Bradbury. You know, it helped give the rise to the term weird fiction, and it's will still used today to describe the specific subgenre of cosmic horror infused with extraterrestrial dread that Lovecraft popularized. You know, another thing that they showed in it was The Outsiders and Others, which was a book written by H.P. Lovecraft. You know, it was a collection of short stories. You know, and it was the first, pretty much the first reference of Lovecraft on this show. And the book is very influential. You know, it contains most of his famous short stories, you know, especially the heavy hitters like The Horror at Red Hook or The Call of Cthulhu, you know. But many of these stories are home to Lovecraft's most direct racist metaphors and allegories, you know, which from what I've read, that he based a lot of his horrors on, you know, when it comes to the foreigners invading America and stuff like that, you know. And the image is blunt. To Lovecraft, to Tick, you know, they're both the outsider and the other. You know, and, it's like the show is constantly reminding it of it when you look at the writings of H.P. Lovecraft and the racist belief of the era, you know, and I'm not sure if, I'm pretty sure that Lovecraft had some racist belief. You know, I know he referenced, one of his writings, 1912 poem on the creation of niggers. I don't know how, I didn't read it, I didn't hear it, but, the lessons said is better, you know what I mean? But, Tick explained to George, that he memorized it so he can understand exactly what he was reading, you know. The show takes place at Arkham, Massachusetts, which is a fictional town in Massachusetts that Lovecraft invented and returned again and again in his fiction. So much to this day, many people think it's a real place, you know. But it's also the name of a small press that Lovecraft published many of his works, you know. But there's a scene in the show where they go visit Arkham, Massachusetts, and it's pretty much best known outside of Lovecraft's work as and I think in the DC the Batman universe they use that as Arkham Asylum and stuff like that. So it's made its round in pop culture and geek culture. You know, one of the things I find interesting is the character of Uncle George is publishing his own version of the Green Book. Now, the Green Book in real life was a series of pamphlets that offered guidance to Black America living under Jim Crow. And pretty much we're trying to help Black Americans figure out, all right, this is how you travel from town to town. This is where these hotels you can visit, these restaurants you can visit. Stay away from this town, stay away from that town. You know, the pamphlets became pretty much widely known after the 2018 debut of the film Green Book, which I was not a fan of. You know, if you want to look at it as just a movie, it's an entertaining movie. But if we talk about it historically, I was like, this movie is not on point at all. You know, first, with the whole character of this, if the guy, I mean, it's a true story, so to speak, but, they took too many liberties with that story. Way too many liberties, from all the way from, an Italian man teaching a black man about James Brown and fried chicken, all the way down to, to the man's personal life. I just felt like it was just another white savior biopic, you know what I mean? But, it won the Oscar for that year, but I always want to see more stuff about Green Book in media, and I appreciate that they used the time in the series to discuss the Green Book and, pretty much showing a legit version of the use of the Green Book. Because I never felt like the Green Book showed a proper, example of what the Green Book was for or how it was used during that time. So in the first episode, they visit a small town. Well, not just any small town, but a sundown town. And, when I say they did it as how I've been imagining how things would be if you're Black in a sundown would be, they did it perfectly. Like, it was literally on point. And, I'm watching this show and I'm just like, HBO just be on point with this, because when you talk about racism in the North, in the sundown towns, well, sometimes called sunset towns, in the northern states, black people were literally, well, unofficially forbidden to be there after dark. You know what I mean? And I don't want to spoil all the stuff that happened in the series because there's a couple of stuff that happened within the characters in this episode. Whether it was their family and especially with the character Lydia and her, the issue that she had with her family and stuff like that. I don't want to spoil it too much, but the highlights of the episode is, especially it's the sundown parts, and there's this one scene where they have this voiceover from James Baldwin where he was debating William F. Buckley back in 1965. He was invited. James Baldwin was invited to Cambridge University to debate the question: is the American dream at the expense of the American Negro? And they used that speech. It was later titled "The American Dream and the American Negro," but in the sundown episode, there was an audio excerpt from that speech where it was overlaid with the montage of of the group's road trip. While they encountered a slice of Americana, which is overshadowed by so much segregation under Jim Crow. And there's a lot of other references in the show, in this episode, I should say, where they talk about when Georges bring up the Shoggoth, which is another Lovecraft monster. There's just a lot of monsters in this. So like you definitely want to do some research on Lovecraft writing as you watch the show because there's so much references. You know what I mean? There was a scene where Tig knows after George recited, "The children of the night, what music they make." That's a very famous quote from Bram Stoker's 1897 vampire novel, Dracula. The vampire inspired our crew to use lights to drive away the monster that attack them in the woods later on in the show. But, I am interested in where this show is going to go. I like it. So anything with black folks and horror, I'm all the way in. You don't have to convince me too much when it comes to, sci-fi and black folks. When black folks and sci-fi, I'm there. I'm in it. Say no more. And I'm curious to see where the show goes. And at first I was cautious, especially with the heaviness of racism all throughout this show. But I see where they're going, and I am for it. So definitely check out Lovecraft Country on HBO. Definitely check out the book. I probably have it in the link in the description on Amazon. But I enjoy it. I think it's worth checking out. And, we'll do more podcasts like this for Geeks in the Trap. Because originally I was going to just make Geeks from the Trap, but just a random spin-off blog. But then, people are like, hey, man, you should just also add it to one of your podcasts because you got so many podcasts already. Why not? So, why not? So until next time, much love, God bless, 2 B's and chicken grease. I'll see you later.